Okay.
Okay. Today, joining Community, we have Carolyn Sears. She's a nuclear engineering master's student at the MIT Nuclear Science and Engineering Department. A recent graduate of the Picker Engineering program at Smith College, she has previously interned at the Nuclear Science and Technology Department of Brookhaven National Laboratory, performing research in the uncertainty quantification for nuclear reactor models. She has several honors and awards, including the Departmental Honors in Engineering Award, awarded to her for her undergraduate thesis. She's also a musician and has received the Seti Lehman Fatman Prize twice and the Sarah Hamilton Memorial Prize. Thank you so much for joining us today, Carolyn. Could you please expand on your professional and educational journey that has led you to where you are right now?
Yes, thank you so much, Ashmita. So I am a native of the Boston area, and I went to high school in this area. And essentially, I guess where my STEM journey started was really in high school, because I was one of those kids that, no one really thought that I was going to go into a STEM field. I think it was because I was, like kind of, shy, but also like a little bit weird, and I liked to draw a lot. So I was, really sort of pigeonholed into being like an art kid. And it was the kind of thing, especially I think when you're a girl and you're into things like art and music and you have like a certain amount of math anxiety, no one thinks that you're ever going to go into a STEM field. But it changed when it was kind of a funny story because I saw a poster for the all girls robotics team that had just formed at my high school. And it was posted in the girls' bathroom, which is, perfect place for marketing for that. And I thought to myself, oh, maybe I could join an all-girls robotics team. That sounds like it could be fun because I had been doing Girl Scouts, and I really liked sort of the all-girls spaces. And I remember saying this to one of my friends and saying, oh, I'm thinking of joining the all-girls robotics team. That sounds like it'll be really fun. And this wasn't a very good friend. We're not friends anymore for reasons you'll find out, because what she said to me was, I don't really see you as someone who could do robotics. You're really more of an artsy girl. And this really like lit a fire underneath me. I was like, oh no, now I need to join this out of like just a little bit of spite because people think I can't do it. So I guess that says a little bit about me as a, 14, 15-year-old. But that was really where sort of my interest in STEM began, because I started going, to these robotics meetings, and we were working on robots. It was for the FTC challenge. So we were making like competition robots that could do little tasks like, pick up balls and launch them into a hoop. So nothing, nothing too intense, but it was just really good experience for learning about the engineering process, and getting some hands-on skills, being able to like use a soldering iron and a band saw and doing fun things that I hadn't had an opportunity to do previously. And so that's really what led me into considering doing engineering in college. But I was, really just enjoying being in these like all girls or all women's spaces. So I ended up applying to Smith College, which is the only women's college, I believe, right now that has an engineering program. And so it's a little bit of an odd program because it's very, very small. I think, and in my time there were maybe about 100 students across all of the 4 years. And I believe my graduating class had about, somewhere between like 26 and 30 people in the engineering graduating class. But it was, because of that, it was a very tight-knit program. It's, just the kind of program where you really get to know your classmates and your professors, and they get, to know you by name. And this is really where I, kind of started blossoming. Blossoming is not a word. Blossoming, as an engineer, because I, there weren't really engineering classes in my high school. So I was, taking math, but, something that I had been carrying with me, this whole time was that, the math anxiety that I've really had, kind of my whole life up until I was in college, because that's really where I, started feeling more confident in myself, being in this place where it was all women, who were all really interested in STEM and all interested in doing things like math, and would never tell you, oh, you seem like you're not the kind of person who would do this. That never happened at Smith College, which was really great. But I found that especially doing math and like learning math in an all-women space was really good for me, because I was able to, especially getting to know my math professors, getting to work in groups with other students, getting to sit in my professor's office hours 3 times a week and doing my homework, was really helpful for really beating the math anxiety that I'd had for years up until when I went to college. And that really, really helped me on my journey to becoming an engineer. And then eventually I did, so during the pandemic, which happened, it started during my sophomore year. So it was about my sophomore spring. And we were all sent home. I think everyone has their own version of this story, but we were, it was right before spring break, and we were told, well, spring break's going to be extended 2 weeks, and you guys all have to leave. And we were all like, okay, what do we do with our lives now? And this is when I decided that I was going to take a year off from college because I had, one of those little existential crises, like, okay, do I really want to be doing school while this major world event is happening? Like I wanted to take some time out to reflect. So even though I was sort of like just hitting my stride, I was thinking I need to take a step back and reflect. And also because I was actually a double major in engineering and music, because I mean I can never really shake my, kind of artsy girl roots. Uh, I play several instruments, including I am mainly a bass player, but I've also done guitar and piano, and I'm trying to learn the saxophone, but I'm not very good yet. Um, and so that was part of my decision to take a leave of absence. Was I was doing this like music major and also being an engineering major, and I really couldn't see myself doing that, over Zoom long term. And so along with sort of that existential, what am I what am I doing this education for type thinking, uh, it was, it just made complete sense for me to take a year off from college. And that's really where I started getting into the nuclear field, because I spent months looking for an internship or a job. I, was applying to everything that I could in the area and trying to see what would come back. But of course, it was a very strange time. So it took a long time to figure out what I was going to do, in the whole summer, applying to job after job and not hearing things back. And then finally, after reaching out to a lot of alums of specifically of Smith College and also the other Seven Sisters, which are also women's colleges in the Northeast US, I heard back from a woman who had become my mentor at Brookhaven Lab, my first mentor at Brookhaven Lab, I should say, because I've had many. And her name was Libby McCutcheon, and she offered me an internship position because we talked over, essentially through a Facebook group for Seven Sisters alumni, because I said, oh, I'm really interested in doing things that involve math or physics or engineering, but I, had so little success at that point because it was, everything was strange from the pandemic. So I hadn't had a lot of, I didn't get so much of a chance to apply to jobs that I just thought were interesting. It was like I have to apply to just about everything and see what will come back, because there were, I guess so many people in my position, lots of people looking for these types of jobs. So I was really interested in just about anything that would sort of use these skills that I had been developing. And so nuclear I thought was extremely cool, and just a very cool way to use these skills. So even though I didn't have a lot of experience with nuclear, essentially none, because Smith College does not specialize in nuclear engineering at all, I, got to learn a lot about it through this opportunity. And so I ended up interning at Brookhaven remotely for a whole year at that point. So in the 2 semesters that I took off and the summer afterwards. So I was working full time for them. And at first I was working in the National Nuclear Data Center under Libby McCutcheon. And oh, she's just a wonderful person and had so many interns, and we had a great time getting to know each other online. It's yeah, an experience that I really enjoyed, because she really helped get me up to speed with with nuclear physics, which is not a small feat, to take someone who, has a general, math and STEM background to, understanding and being able to work with nuclear data in particular, because we were working at the National Nuclear Data Center, the NNDC. And in that time, I also was able to publish my first paper, which is something that she helped me a lot with. So I learned a lot about this, academic writing style, also about scientific communication. I learned how to put together a conference talk and give a talk at a conference. I actually gave talks at, I think, 2 different conferences in that time. And it was so just a really wonderful research experience. And in this time, I also met my second major mentor at Brookhaven Lab, Arancha Quadra, who I also just love. She's so amazing. And she offered me the internship with her in the funniest way possible, which was emailing me and saying, do you want to join the dark side? Because I had been working more in nuclear physics, and she offered me a position working under her doing more nuclear engineering modeling, because I had said, my background's really in nuclear engineering. I think I'd like to do, some of that. I do essentially both right now. I'm kind of both in both fields of nuclear physics and nuclear engineering. They're very related. And yes, so I worked under her, and then at the end of that year, I did go back to Smith College. So I did finish out the last 2 years. But in that time, it was really like, it was actually a little bit rough going back, I think for a lot of reasons, because we were, it was, I guess, the fall of 2021, and we were all sort of trying to figure out how to do things in person again. And something that I realized that I missed because there were no nuclear engineering classes at Smith or, or anything even in the Pioneer Valley, which is, or Western Massachusetts. So I really felt like I had, I made this great progress in doing things with nuclear engineering and learning about it, but I didn't, have anywhere to apply that knowledge anymore. And it felt really strange. So I ended up emailing my mentor Rancha Quadra again and saying, I'd, really like to work with you again. And I'd like to do my senior thesis with you. And with the Nuclear Science and Technology Department at Brookhaven. And to my great luck was that she said yes. And so I ended up being able to go to Brookhaven the following summer. And I spent the whole summer living there on site. And it's on Long Island, so it was very beautiful. And just it was a great summer getting to work with all of them in person. And then I went back to Smith, and it was a little bit interesting doing doing a thesis where none of my professors really knew what I was doing because they didn't know anything about essentially what I was doing for my senior thesis was creating a tool that would do uncertainty quantification on the reactor models that we were trying to make because all of the data has a little bit of uncertainty to it. And so this was also a collaboration with the National Nuclear Data Center. And essentially because there's a little bit of uncertainty on all of the data, if you put that into a model, it all propagates. So we wanted to make a software tool. So that was sort of the engineering focus of my thesis, was saying, well, I can make a software tool that will tell you how much error has propagated so that you can trust your model more by saying this is, how accurate it is. And so that, in general, people could understand, why that's a useful thing, but any of the specifics, none of my professors had ever, heard of this before. And so I had an advisor at Smith, and then I had all of the folks at Brookhaven advising me on the technical aspects. And I would go to my advisor at Smith and my professors and tell them what I was working on and ask for their advice. And they would say, like, I think, Carolyn, you probably got this more than you think you do because, we don't know what you're talking about. You've got to trust yourself, and we trust you too. So that was also a really, I think, impactful experience for me, is having that much trust from my professors that I could do this project by myself and with the folks at Brookhaven without any sort of like expectation necessarily. Like they weren't going through my work with a fine-tooth comb because they didn't really have that knowledge to to be able to do so. So to have that trust and be like, I'm the one who's making sure that this is good quality. Me and the folks at Brookhaven are doing that. So I found that to be incredibly impactful. And then, so it was also, the same folks at Brookhaven, my mentor, Arancha, was the one who inspired me essentially to go to grad school because it was sort of a slow process because I had been sort of flip-flopping back and forth of, oh, maybe I should go work for industry for a few years and then go to grad school, or I should go to grad school right out of college. And then if I go to grad school, then do I pursue a master's or a PhD first, or, one then the other? And I just, and I had been changing my mind every couple of weeks for a while. And then Arancha suggested to me a virtual career fair, or no, sorry, a virtual graduate school fair that was hosted by the American Nuclear Society. And she said, oh, this is something that, that landed in my inbox. You should go check it out. And I, so I'd been sort of in a space where I was like, oh no, I think I'm not going to go to grad school. But I was like, oh, but I should check out the graduate school fair anyways, because, it seemed like a good way to broaden my horizons, I suppose. And I ended up talking to several professors from MIT at that graduate fair and from some other schools. But that was sort of the first day that I realized, oh, I really could go to graduate school, because being able to talk to professors from MIT, and I think because I've sort of grown up near MIT my whole life, I sort of had this idea of them in my head of that, like, MIT is a little bit scary, like, oh, they're like this big school with so many awesome people doing so much awesome work. Oh, it could never be me, of course. Like, I could never be at MIT. But then getting to actually talk to them, I was like, actually, they are just regular people when it comes down to, I mean, they're regular people who do incredibly cool things that I admire so much. But they were fun to talk to, and they gave me really great information about the program and made it sound like something that I, could do and was, welcome to apply for. Because I think at that point I thought, oh, I can't even apply to MIT, because I, had been thinking, oh, what schools have good nuclear engineering grad programs? And of course, MIT was on the list, but I thought, oh, but of course I can't apply there. That would, that would be silly. It'd be a waste of my time. And so I guess fast forward a few months later, I was talking to more professors and ended up getting an acceptance letter in my inbox and was, over the moon, because I was, I'd been putting in my, my grad school applications and thinking, it's like, well, I'm putting in a few others just because I don't think MIT is going to say yes, of course. But no, so I think I really undersold myself at that point. And so I've learned a lot from that experience as well. But essentially, that's how I started. And I did end up after my senior year continuing on working on my thesis with Brookhaven. So I was interning there up until essentially August of last year. And ever since then, I've been in my master's program at MIT. And my current research is so I'm essentially working in two groups at once. So I'm part of the computational reactor physics group, and I'm also part of the nuclear reactor laboratory. And my official position is I'm a research assistant, or an RA. So I'm essentially half-time a student and half-time a research assistant. And I'm working on a thesis that is about one of the experimental facilities at the nuclear reactor laboratory. So our reactor is called the MITR, which stands for Massachusetts Institute of Technology Reactor. And it is a very unique and I'd say wonderful facility that has some incredible people working there and incredible facilities and experimental capabilities. It's part of a project that is called the RERTR project, which stands for Reduced Enrichment for Research and Test Reactors. And so my thesis is part of that larger project. So essentially what that means is different reactors run on a different amount of uranium, which is the fissile isotope in nuclear reactors. And some reactors that are used for research are using quite a lot of this fissile isotope, which is called uranium-235. And this can be upwards of, say, like 95%, which the government has thought for a long time is quite a lot to be in a civilian reactor. And so the goal is to put that down to maybe 20%, or essentially a bit under 20%, because the limit is now 20%. And essentially, the goal is to take one of these facilities that's part of the MITR. So it's not the reactor itself, because that has its own essentially there's its own project for converting the fuel to this new, what we call low enriched uranium fuel from what's currently the high enriched uranium fuel. And my thesis project right now is working on taking an experimental facility which uses some of the fuel from the MITR so that it can also be converted to low enriched uranium.
Thank you so much for sharing your trajectory in STEM, your career. Just to summarize, so you knew you were interested in a STEM career when you were in high school, but you were known sort of as an artsy kid. And what really jump-started sort of your thinking in STEM was joining the all-girls like robotics team at your high school. And then you applied to Smith College because you enjoyed that environment and that support of having like a all-girl and women's community. And you took a break from college during your sophomore year because of the pandemic, and that's when you joined the Brookhaven lab and you got more interested in nuclear science and engineering. And then from there, you applied to grad school, and now you're currently working at MIT on the technology you just mentioned. So I guess like going back, because I know you mentioned that during your time at Brookhaven, you had two great mentors. Could you sort of expand on like the mentorship and the support network and how that sort of played out in your career and like how that helped you in pursuing what you're doing right now?
Yes, of course. So I think starting with my first mentor, Livy McCutcheon, so she's essentially, why I am here right now, because she's the one who sort of saw me and saw my, Smith College, background and said, like she really saw something in me, even though we were essentially strangers. We met over a Facebook group that, of people, in the five, no, not the five, sorry, the Seven Sisters. The Five Colleges is the consortium that Smith is in, and the Seven Sisters is a different consortium. So we met over a Facebook group for the Seven Sisters alums and people, looking for opportunities. And so it's really a group where people, can recognize the skills that come out of, that come from people who have gone to women's college. And so that connection between us, I think, helped her see something in me. And then I said, yeah, she did so much for me, because after, accepting me for this position, she helped me by giving me lots of resources, things, especially like textbook recommendations, things to read to get up to speed on nuclear energy, nuclear physics. She also gave me, a lot of personal lectures. So, really one-on-one, or, one on two or three, because she also took other interns, which, was, it made the experience, even better to have, a couple of other students to be working with and, bouncing ideas off of. And really just making friends with as well, because we had, a group chat where we could discuss things. And she would also introduce me to her colleagues. So I was working a lot, not just with her, but with her colleagues and postdocs that worked with her. So yeah, having that network, expand through her was a very impactful thing in my experience, because then, I went, from being someone who didn't know a lot about nuclear and didn't know very many people in the field to knowing, a handful of people in the field. And from then it just, grew and grew. And, you know, along with essentially teaching me all the things that I knew about nuclear physics at that point, and introducing me to people who would teach me even more, she made sure to give me every opportunity that she could think of. So every time something landed in her inbox of saying like, oh, you should have your interns apply for this, or submit something to this, she would forward it to my inbox and say, oh, Carolyn, this sounds great for you. And so she really helped me find these opportunities. It's like after she had given me a huge opportunity, she just kept smaller opportunities coming, which included doing things like speaking at the Nuclear Data Week conference, which is a conference that's put on by the National Nuclear Data Center. And she helped me prepare for that. We did several rounds of working on my slides, and she would have me do dry runs and make sure that everything like fit in the time frame, essentially like telling me all of the things that people had sort of glossed over before, because I think there's a certain point where people just expect that you know how to make a PowerPoint presentation, but actually there's a lot of nuance that goes into making a scientific presentation that people can actually understand. And it's difficult, especially if you have a 5-minute time limit or a 15-minute time limit to get something extremely technical across to people, even in your own field, because people can have very, very niche research interests. You can say something that you think is fairly well understood, and people will say, I'm not really in that part of the field and I have no idea what you're talking about. So being able to, even talk to other people who, are in the nuclear field, it takes, good science communication skills. And so she really worked with me on that, as did the folks at Brookhaven's Office of Educational Programs. I had several really excellent mentors there who, again, their jobs were essentially to make sure that we had skills communicating what our research was, and would organize groups of interns. Especially during the pandemic, it was very helpful because we they would organize for us to meet with interns who were at other parts of the lab. So I met people who were doing biology research or astrophysics research, and getting to communicate to them. And I know I had a very interesting experience at one point because that really sort of informed how I tried to do science communication, where I was trying to explain a concept about something called gamma ray spectroscopy, which is essentially measuring the energy of gamma rays that comes off of a radioactive material. And I was using the word nucleus a lot in this presentation that I was giving. So I was giving sort of a dry run to another student to see if he could understand it. And he gave me the most notable feedback I had ever gotten, which I don't know a lot about biology, but it sounds like you know what you're talking about, which was so funny because I, realized that I had said nucleus a lot, and it wasn't clear from what I had said that it wasn't the nucleus of a cell. It was, the nucleus of an atom. And that has really affect how I, think about how to do science communication, how to do presentations. So those, so were some very impactful experiences I had with my first mentor at Brookhaven. And also, especially my second mentor at Brookhaven, Arancha, was someone who was also very helpful with, just giving me every opportunity that I could have, especially, how she helped me get into grad school. And, part of that was, me going to her in our weekly meetings, and, we would talk about my thesis and talk about my research. And then I'd say, okay, Arancha, how do I apply to grad school? What do I do? I need some help. I need some advice. And, I would, ask her questions like, what are they really looking for in a personal statement? How do I talk to these people? Because, I was, just not sure. And having someone who had gone through that process, and also, and even, she had worked with people at MIT before, so she knew a bit about their program, and, sort of knew how to tell me, like, she knew like what I was supposed to do, to start that process of like becoming a graduate student and becoming like more of a professional researcher, and essentially talking to me as as a colleague. That was something that I really felt with with really both of my mentors, is that they they did see me as a student and someone that they were teaching, but they did respect me as someone who was doing work with them and not just for them. Because something I think I mentioned this earlier, but my mentors have been very great about having me be first author on different technical reports and academic journal papers, because something that they have, said to me is, like, you did this work, you wrote this paper, so, I'm not going to put my name ahead of yours just because I'm your PI, because I'm like leading this project. And that's something that I found very impactful, and I think has been a good part of having female mentors in particularly. I have also worked with men, of course, because I'd say I don't think that gender parity has been accomplished in the nuclear field at all. I think I read a sad statistic somewhere that it's more of an 80-20 split. So I've been very lucky to have some really great female role models in the field. And it's been great because they do really respect me as a person and say, like, you should take the credit for this, where the credit is due. And, having them, say that explicitly to me, and, sort of, not just saying that, but, actually letting me do these things, letting me take, the lead in these projects was extremely helpful for, building my confidence and my knowledge base.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Going back to like your previous like overall trajectory of how you got into where you are right now, I know you mentioned that between like your high school years and your undergrad years, you had math anxiety, and that's something that you overcame with like office hours and talking to your professors. Do you mind expanding more on what that is in case any of our listeners are also experiencing that and interested in knowing like how can they overcome that?
Yes, this is something I'm very passionate about, honestly, because which is why I mentioned it earlier, because I know that it can sometimes feel very, very, very overwhelming to do math, and I think it's something that starts in a lot of people. It's not just a thing for girls; it can be for boys too. But I'd say especially sometimes girls can have the issue of, you start learning math and maybe something doesn't quite click, and you get nervous, and it's the kind of problem that snowballs because math builds on itself. So when you're learning it, and if you're like, I don't really know my times tables, then suddenly when they get, you get to a more complicated kind of problem, then you're really just, just feeling very lost, and it just gets worse and worse from there. And what happens, I think, especially to girls, is that people start writing them off because people say, oh, well, she didn't get it then, she's not getting it now, so like there's no point, she's just going to go off and do a job that doesn't require math. But I don't think that's a good way to look at people or children, people, children, life, because everyone needs some math. I think the people who really, really hate math are missing out on some very fun and interesting topics, and also just some, basic literacy that I think that all, people should have, the ability to read a graph or a chart, that you see on the news. Having those skills, I think, is imperative for, for all people. So I think it's really important for, people to not give up on girls who are expressing math anxiety. And I think I guess to express for people who, kind of don't quite know what I'm talking about, or, feel like they might, but don't, want more explicit description, I'd say what happened to me is, when I was young, I would try to do a math problem, and I would just, I would get like kind of sweaty palms and my heart would start racing, and I just, and I would shut down a little bit sometimes. So it would, that's why it's, a problem that snowballs out of control sometimes, because you get so nervous that, even if you're trying to learn the math and you're trying your best, sometimes you're so nervous that you don't retain any of that information. So you can be, doing math for years and just, and feeling really bad the whole time and not getting all that you need to, even if you do have really good math teachers. And it was something that I think, looking back on it, I can really see like how math anxiety more affected how I thought about myself more so than how I actually did math, because my grades weren't bad. I wasn't objectively, you could look at my, math papers and say like, you understand most of this. Sometimes I'd be a little slow at it, or I'd, make a few little mistakes, or type something into the calculator wrong and it would come out funny. But overall, I'd say like I understood most of the topics, but I just felt like I didn't. And that was really the part that I think was maybe the hardest to get over, and just took a lot of practice. Because I think, yeah, I'd say the good news for anyone who's listening to this is that math anxiety, it's very real, and it is something that you can work through. And I think the hard part about working through it is that it does take time, and I think it also takes a lot of kindness and patience from the people around you, which I was really lucky to find at Smith College, because I had math teachers who really were, able to sit down with me, and if I said, okay, I've looked at this problem and I have no idea what's going on, and just looking at it makes me so nervous. And they'd say, okay, let's break it down. Let's do it on the board together, and let's talk through all the steps. And something actually interesting that Smith, I'm not sure if this is done in the classes anymore, but when I was at Smith College, they had assignments that they would call written assignments, and it's essentially exactly what you what it sounds like, but they would make you write out all of the steps in words for how to do a math problem, and I thought that that was an extremely helpful way of thinking about math, and I still use that to this day when I'm working through my nuclear physics problem sets because sometimes if I'm, sort of struggling with a concept, I'll try to explain it to myself in words and saying, well, what am I trying to do here? What is this math trying to express? Because then it can be a lot easier to find an equation that makes sense and, do all of the steps that make sense. Because if I can't explain it in words, then you don't understand it. I think that's the thing. So I think that's, one way that you can help yourself get over math anxiety is by sitting down and giving yourself time to really think through math in sort of that step-by-step way and not getting too bogged down by saying, oh, I don't know what this symbol means. It's like, well, if you don't know what the symbol means, the best thing to do is break it into smaller chunks so it's not as scary looking, because you can look at a big equation and say, oh no, I don't know what any of this means, it's so scary. But if you say, well, the important part is I know what some of these symbols mean, but I just don't know what this one means, and I can Google that, or I can ask someone friendly what it means, and then you can piece together what everything means. But I do think, yeah, having very patient people around you, because I think sometimes what happens too with girls is that people, when they've already written you off and said, oh, I think you just can't do math. They're not nice to you, and it makes it worse because they'll say, well, you just can't do this. It's like, I'm not going to help you because I think you can't do this. So having people who are not like that in my life helped. And I think also there can sometimes be pressure, I think, when you're trying to go into a STEM field, that people want you to accelerate and keep taking the highest level of math that you possibly can. And I think that that's something that is not always good for people, especially if you're dealing with some math anxiety, because you start trying to compare yourself to people who did, find it a bit easier to start out doing math and don't have these sort of snowballing problems that have been accumulating, and especially by the time you get, to high school or college, it can be years of math anxiety. So it does take time and patience to work through it, but it is possible, because I am a living example that it is possible. And I will tell everyone anything about math that I know, because I do now love math. And and I still struggle with it too sometimes. I forget what symbols mean sometimes, and I have to look them up because, but it doesn't make me feel nervous to do that anymore. And that's, I think, the important part. But I think something that really helped me, especially, was that when I started college, I had already taken calculus in high school, but I decided to take calculus 1 again when I got to Smith, because I realized that, something that I really needed was practice. I didn't need to learn more math. I just needed to keep learning the same math for, another few months, just so that I knew I felt comfortable doing it. And I thought that was a really helpful thing, because I saw other people in my life who said, oh, well, I've already taken calculus, so I'll go into calculus 2 or calculus 3 right away. And then they thought it was, incredibly hard because they were trying to deal with all of the transition of going to college and, learning in the learning in college is a little bit different than learning in high school. So when you're trying to adjust to how lectures are structured and how homework assignments and textbook readings are structured, sometimes it can be hard to, learn the new material on top of that. So I saw that some people who tried to accelerate because they were like, oh, well, I'm really good at math, I'm really good at science, and I want to be an engineer. And they really struggled. And I gave myself a bit of an easier time because I already knew that that I had struggled. So respecting that in myself, I think that's, one of the first things to getting over math anxiety is respecting yourself and your math anxiety, and realizing that it is hard and it is, stressful. So putting yourself in more stressful situations is never going to help, but trying to lower that stress is the goal.
Okay. Thank you so much for sharing that
Yeah.
advice. And just to sort of recap what you said, there's acknowledgement of like you having math anxiety, and also respecting yourself and giving yourself that kindness and patience you deserve
Mhm.
to overcome that. And also seeking out and having support systems in place where there are people who can help you overcome those like math problems that you don't understand, without dismissing you and your passions and your passion towards going into STEM. Correct.
Mhm.
Okay, thank you so much. I guess moving into more about representation of women in STEM, which is what this platform is really mainly about highlighting stories that really show like the broad topics in STEM that you can go into. I guess what are your some of your thoughts about representation of women in STEM and how diversity and inclusion sort of impacts STEM innovation? And I know you've talked about this like throughout your entire interview about being in mainly female-led spaces and having that support. So if you'd like to elaborate on that.
Yeah, and so yes, I've obviously been in a lot of women-centered, or also as we call it, historically women-centered, because I know a lot of people who are in these like traditionally women spaces who don't identify as women. So I would say I expand out this question to people of also gender minorities.
Mhm.
And I think that in my own life, I've noticed that there really aren't a lot of people that I get to look up to in the media. I know there's definitely some, Marie Curie comes to mind, but I never really grew up thinking, oh, I want to be just like this person, because there wasn't just one person who I thought that's who I want to be, because there, just weren't. It's something that I do in the last few years. People have been trying to put more spotlights onto, especially historical women in STEM and math. But I, as a kid, didn't see so much of that. And so I had to, if I wanted to find someone to be a role model, I had to look, kind of very close by to myself. So people especially, just other high school girls when I was on the robotics team really served as, my first role model. So people that I knew in general, and then, people like my professors, and again, other students when I was at Smith College, and at the labs, and even, now at MIT, I'd say, all of the, very awesome women engineers at MIT are serving as great role models for me, especially my advisor, Dr. Linwen Hu, who is a senior research scientist at the Nuclear Reactor Laboratory. She is, a great role model for me, and and she has really put together a team that has very good gender diversity. And that's something that I respect a lot about our department, that they're really trying to get more gender parity, because it is, as I said, the field really does not have very good representation of women. So it is something that I see people trying to combat. And in my own life, I've just tried to manage it by surrounding myself with women so that I do have role models. And I would suggest that for anyone who is looking for a role model, that, sometimes it's not going to be, easy to find a role model in, media. I know there just aren't there's I think like some movies and TV shows that show prominent female scientists, but I, you know, didn't really have those as a kid. And I would say finding people in your, in your life, in your local area and at your school, a role model doesn't have to be someone who, is super famous, and they don't have to be, they don't have to have been alive 100 years ago and in all of the history textbooks. They can just be, another classmate that you just think is really awesome and has cool ideas. And, a role model can also be a friend sometimes. They can just be someone that you say, this person's really cool and I want to hang out with them and get to learn from them, and be more like them in my life. And I think that's an important thing, for representation, is just finding people around you. I don't know. It's like, I don't know if that answers the question.
That does answer the question. Thank you for sharing that perspective. So I know you've mentioned that currently you work at a place where they're trying to be more gender inclusive. I guess, what do you think institutions and organizations as a whole can do to create more inclusive environments for women in STEM, where there's not only inclusion but also like support?
Mm. Yes, I do think that, learning from the Smith College model, which is just, well, what if you only have women? That would be my that would be my first choice, is say, okay, well, we're just gonna have women. That is a joke, actually. But that gives rise to my real answer, which is, I think the most important thing is just making sure that there is sort of a critical mass of women, because it's one thing to have one woman in and say, okay, well, we're going to have our one woman to give us some diversity, which I think is where some people, especially in sort of like high positions, you see this in sort of the tech world, where a company will hire like a female CEO, and then none of the people around her are women, and so you can talk all you want about, it's like, oh well, how do we support this one woman, or the two women in the department, but the fact that there's only one or two is still going to be a major problem. So I think the real thing that causes change is when you start getting to that like higher percentage of women. So you really want to have, really like 50-50%, 50% men and women. Sorry, to gender minorities, some percentage of gender minorities as well. But we don't have very good statistics on them, I don't think. But having diverse gender in your workplace, in your lab, I think is very important because having the support of the people around you is how you can make change. Because it's not just, oh, how do we support this one person? It's, well, there are, 50 of us. Say there's 50 of us, and we're all going to get together. And if there's something that we need to have changed, we can talk about it and we can collectively act and ask for it. And I think that's one of the most important things is being able to support each is up to them in a lot of ways to to do better, to make sure that women feel more included, and feel like they're being respected and listened to at work. And also, I think, yeah, having more women around does keep people accountable. So
Mm,
that is something, I think the best thing is making sure that more women get past the process of being hired or being, accepted as grad students, which does also, I think, start from the earlier stage of making sure that women know that you can apply, because that was my own problem with thinking, oh, well, of course I'd never get into this thing if I applied, but that's not true because I'm here. So I'm living proof that, you know, if you do put your hat in the ring, if you do think, okay, well, I could do this, and especially having great mentors who say, hey, you should go to this graduate fair, or like, yes, you should apply to this program. Yes, this is how I'm going to help you. You know, ask ask good questions at the graduate fair and write things. Write a really good personal statement. That's yeah, that is sort of the step negative one to representation is making sure that girls and women actually are applying and actually feel like they're allowed to apply for these opportunities, then getting them into those spaces and then having a critical mass of them so that there can be enough support.
yeah. I guess moving on to our next question, which is, how do you think that storytelling or sharing personal experiences can like benefit and inspire future generations? I know we have you right now, and having your story presented definitely will reach girls who are like, oh, maybe I wasn't really sure about this career path, but it's something that I would like to look into. And the stories, like your personal experiences, kind of resemble mine. Like, I think that's really powerful and impactful. And I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, I love telling stories to people. I think people probably would say that I tell too many stories. But that's I think it's naturally just who I am. So of course, I find that to be a big value, because yeah, I think part of my life has always been searching for people who will help me achieve my goals, because I have had experiences where I say to people, I want to do this thing, and they say, well, no, I don't think you should do that thing, even though they're just using stereotypes, or they're using a very narrow view of who I am. So I think it's very powerful to get to tell my stories to people. I'm a Girl Scout leader, and I have been for a few years with the troop that I used to be in when I was in middle school and high school. And I love telling them about what I do every day. And, I think sometimes I probably get a little bit too technical and it goes over their heads if they're, in middle school and haven't, had a lot of knowledge of physics or chemistry yet. But I do, like that I'm getting to tell them, what I do every day, and, giving them the sense that this is a career path that someone who was just like them, because I was in their same Girl Scout troop, we grew up in the same area, we went to the same schools, and this is where I am today. So I like that they get to see that this is, you know, one path that you can take. And I think it is important to hear other people's stories so that people do know, how it's done. And I think also this is why I say I do think the best role models are people who are, in your life, people who you can talk to and have a personal connection with, because getting to hear someone's stories, and especially like their pathways in sort of a personal and practical way, is very helpful, because, getting to hear, oh, this is how I chose, my grad school, and this is how I chose to apply to this, program or internship, is super helpful, because it can tell you, well, what it's like when you're trying to find your path, saying, well, this is what worked for someone that I really respect, and someone whose work that I admire. So I'm going to, try to do the same thing. Or, but putting your own spin on it, of course.
Yeah, I guess going back to like earlier in our interview when we were talking about sort of your younger self, your high school self, and getting through like undergrad and pursuing nuclear science and engineering. If you had like the option to give your younger self any advice, what would that be and why?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. I'm gonna think about this for a minute, because I think
Of course.
um yeah, I think my younger self, yeah, I mean, as I've said, she had really bad math anxiety. And, I like, she was very creative, but just, kind of one of those like little balls of energy, but I didn't really know where to put it. And so I was always, making little things and, trying new things out and reading a ton. But I think, yeah, the thing that I would have wanted her to know is just things don't always stay the same, and that isn't bad. Let's see if I can put that in a more eloquent way. Yeah, I think that something that I didn't really understand is that, when there are problems and when something is hard, it isn't going to stay that way, because as you practice and as you, work towards a goal, I think that was something that I really struggled with as a kid, was essentially setting a goal for myself and knowing how to reach it. And that's something that in the last few years I've gotten really good at, because I've had a lot of situations where someone says, well, you need to pick a goal for this project. You need to pick a goal for your undergrad thesis, for example, or your master's thesis, and you need to write out a plan for how to get it. And so I would tell my younger self that, you know, you have so much energy and so many ideas, and the things that you need is like to, figure out how to harness that energy so that it's not just coming all out as anxiety, and getting, stressed and frustrated, because having a goal and then breaking it down into steps to get there feels a lot more fulfilling than, um, you know, I guess just trying out a lot of things and not being very good at them, or being, good at them at various levels and then giving up when they get a little bit hard. Because I know that I think is something that a lot of kids can relate to, is just, because, one of the great things I think about being a kid, being young, is that which, I'm still young. I still, count myself in this category, that there's a lot of things that you can try out and you don't have to stick with them.
Mm.
So, for example, like you can pick up a new hobby, and, I'm always trying to pick up a new instrument. And, just because it doesn't go great doesn't mean that it can't be, you can have a goal to get better at something if you're not great at it, or you can say, I tried this and I'm really proud of myself for trying. But actually it wasn't as fun as I thought it was. So, and it's sort of, yeah, I'd say my best advice is try to find, try out a lot of things and try to find something that makes you want to have a goal, so that you can work towards it and break it down into steps, and feel, fulfilled in having accomplished something, even if that's something small, like, learning how to play the saxophone. Well, that's actually playing the saxophone is really hard, as I've found out.
Thank you. And I guess going a little bit broader, what is some guidance or advice that you would offer to those watching this interview right now, and especially any young girls watching this interview and thinking about aspiring in a career in STEM?
Let's see. Oh, I have a funny answer. Because I promised myself when I was graduating college that I was only, if people wanted advice about college, that I was only going to tell them that my advice is to brush your teeth. Because, but I do think there's actually a good nugget of wisdom in here, because I guess what I mean by that is the most important thing to remember when you're like, I just spent a few minutes talking about, like, an important thing is like finding goals to set for yourself and figuring out how to achieve them, in whatever way that you want to. But sometimes, when you have a goal and you're really interested in it, it can take up a lot of time and energy, and you forget about, yourself and your needs. So I'd say for people who are, for women who are really interested in going into a STEM career, it is, like doing any undergraduate degree, any graduate program, it takes a lot of work, and a lot of time. And something that's really important is taking, some time to not do those things, to make sure that you do have a hobby, and very much brush your teeth. Because you'll just feel better if you brush your teeth, and, and if you take a shower, you know, because I know a lot of people who get so stuck in doing problem sets that they forget to do these, also like eating, exercising, sleeping. They're all very important things for having a career in STEM. They're important for any career, but people, I think, especially in STEM, because we can be so passionate about what we're trying to do, we will forget, to take care of ourselves. And I think, yeah, also, yeah, having outside hobbies, because something that I noticed when I switched from high school to college was because, engineering through doing the robotics team had been my extracurricular up until I graduated and started doing engineering as my, sort of full-time. Well, I was also doing the music major, so I sort of had a built-in, sort of counterbalance to my engineering work, but you really do need something that's not engineering or math when you're doing that all the time, every day. And especially if that was your hobby before, you do need to find a new hobby so that you don't get stuck in that every day. So that is, I'd say that's my best advice is, make sure that your life, is is balanced, has, room for things like fun in it and, and personal hygiene. Yes.
Thank you so much for sharing that advice. And thank you so, so much for being here. It was truly an honor to speak with you, Carolyn. Yeah,
Yes, and thank you so much.